So what happens when centuries of tradition just slam head-on into the forces of modern democracy? Well, we're going to find out. Today, we're diving into a classic study of social change in a single South Indian village, where the old, rigid hierarchies of caste were forced to deal with the brand new realities of power. You know, the whole idea behind this book is just so powerful. It basically says a village isn't some kind of isolated time capsule stuck in the past. Nope. Think of it more like a crossroads, a single point on the map where these huge forces of history, social, economic, and political, all converge and play out in the everyday lives of real people. And to see these massive shifts happening all across post-independence India, the tale takes us deep into the life of this one specific community, Sripuram. It's right here in this fertile river delta that we get a front row seat to see centuries of tradition meeting the 20th century. Okay, so first things first, let's get our bearings by looking at the social map of Sripuram. And what's so fascinating is that this map wasn't just some abstract idea in people's heads, it was literally physically carved into the layout of the village by the caste system. This right here shows you just how visible and inescapable that social hierarchy was. Right at the heart of the village, you've got the Brahmin Agraharam, the center of ritual purity. Then you have the streets for the non-Brahmin castes in the middle. And way out on the fringe, physically separate, is the Cherry, the settlement for the Adi-Dravidas, which was considered ritually polluted. I mean, think about that. Where you lived literally defined who you were. In the contrast, well, it couldn't be more stark. The Agraharam was a community of solid brick and mortar homes, with all these strict rules about purity. The Cherry, on the other hand, was a world of mud and thatch huts, a place so ritually separate that tradition actually forbade Brahmins from even stepping foot inside it. You've got two completely different worlds, right there in the same tiny village. And this separation wasn't just about where you lived. Oh no. It was a complex web of rules that governed every single daily interaction, constantly reinforcing this rigid hierarchy. You couldn't share a meal with someone from another caste. You couldn't walk down certain streets. You couldn't even go into the main temples. The system was so detailed that it even created divisions within the lowest castes. This story from the village just perfectly illustrates how deeply these lines were drawn. It wasn't about making a simple mistake. It shows you that the smallest little thing, a gesture, the way you perform a ritual before eating, could instantly give you away and lead to some really severe consequences. All right, so that's the social structure. Now let's peel back another layer and look at Sripuram's economic engine, which was based almost entirely on one thing: land. At the very, very top of the economic pyramid, you had the Mirazdars. These were the landowners. They controlled pretty much all of the wealth and power in the village because they controlled the land. A lot of them weren't even living there. They were absentee landlords, managing their property from the city. Okay, so below the landowners were the tenants, the kata-hiders. These were the folks who actually farmed the land. But, and this is a big but, they were locked into a lease system where they owed a fixed amount of their harvest to the landowner. It didn't matter if you had a great year or a terrible one, the rent was the same. And then, at the very bottom, you had the landless laborers, the puniols. These people owned no land, they had no lease. Their only asset was their own physical labor, which they sold for daily wages. This left them completely dependent on the people above them just to survive. So there you have it, a really clear-cut, three-tiered structure: the owner, the tenant, and the laborer. It was a simple but incredibly rigid pyramid that basically decided your economic fate in Sripuram. Now, for centuries, these two systems, caste and class, they lined up almost perfectly. It was almost like a formula. If you knew someone's caste, you could pretty much guess their economic class. The Brahmin Mirazdars owned the land, and the non-Brahmin and Adi-Dravida castes worked it. Simple as that. But then, everything started to change. After India's independence in 1947, a new player entered the game, a third force that started to pull these neat and tidy alignments apart. And that force was democratic politics. Suddenly, the very definition of power began to shift, and dramatically. It was no longer just about what you were born with, your caste, your family's land. A whole new kind of power was emerging, one based on things you could go out and get: votes, connections to political parties, and relationships with government officials. Okay, so that's the theory, but this wasn't just some abstract idea. This shift had real, tangible, and often messy consequences for the people living in the village. So, what did this new game actually look like on the ground? Well, for the first time ever, real political power wasn't just inherited. It could be won. The new village council, the panchayat, became this new battleground for influence. And because democracy is a numbers game, power started to slide away from the elite but small Brahmin minority and towards the much, much larger non-Brahmin castes. They could finally turn their numbers into votes and votes into actual power. And you can see this massive change in these small but incredibly significant moments. There was an old saying that a Vaishnava Brahmin shouldn't even step foot in a Shiva temple if he was being chased by an elephant. Yet here we have a prominent Iyengar Brahmin not just entering one, but joining its renovation committee. This wasn't just a personal choice. It was a huge public signal that the old ritual walls were starting to crumble under the pressure of new political alliances. So, where does all this leave us? We've looked at the 3 different maps of Sripuram: the social map of caste, the economic map of class, and this new political map of power. And the really crucial point is that they don't line up anymore. They're all jumbled. And this brings us to the single most important takeaway of the entire study. Béteille's conclusion was that power in the village had become, in his words, free-floating. It was no longer chained to the top of the caste and landowning hierarchies. It had broken free, and now it was pretty much up for grabs. This created a brand new and much more complicated reality. Sure, your caste still mattered for your ritual status, and of course, owning land was still a huge economic advantage. But now, political power could be achieved completely separately from both. So you could have these strange new combinations: a Brahmin landowner with high status but very little real political clout. Or you could be a non-Brahmin tenant farmer with powerful political connections that gave you real authority in the village. You know, this old Tamil saying, it captures this long-held dream of social mobility, of lower castes slowly climbing the ladder. Well, what the new political system did was like throwing gasoline on that fire. Suddenly, moving up in the world through political power wasn't just a distant dream. It was a real, tangible possibility. In the end, the story of Sripuram from the 1960s is this incredibly powerful snapshot of a society right in the middle of a massive transformation. It shows us that even when the formal rules of power change, the deep legacies of caste and class don't just disappear. They continue to shape and influence society in all sorts of complex ways, which really makes you ask, how are these same dynamics still playing out all around us today?